Okay, so in this video, I'll be showing you how to make a low poly portrait, just like this guy right here. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is find a picture to use. I recommend taking a picture off of your phone, maybe doing a picture of yourself or one of your friends, just because with that, we know that it's going to be a pretty high quality image. If not, you can always go to Google Images and get a picture off of there, but you want to make sure that it's a big, like a large, high quality photo. And just so like when we zoom in, like we can see the details of the face without things getting too grainy or pixelated. And so this is the picture that I have chosen for mine, and you can choose whoever you want for yours. The first step that we need to do to get ready for this, to make a low poly portrait, is to set up a grid. So to do that, we're going to go to Edit, all the way down to Preferences, and then Guides, Grid, and Slices. And then right here, we're looking in this grid section. So this part, it's going to be kind of weird because it's going to be different for everybody depending on the size of your photo. I'm just going to kind of guess with mine. I'm going to do 0.25 inches. Maybe I'll make 8 subdivisions. And then this is the color of what your grid will be. I'm going to change mine to red just because I know I have a lot of gray in my image already, and red is just a lot easier to see on top of the picture itself. And then I'll press OK. You'll notice nothing really popped up. I don't see a grid or anything. In order to do that, you need to go to View, Show, and then Grid. And the shortcut on your keyboard is going to be Control''. This will be important because you're going to sometimes want to pop the grid on and off while you're working to see how things are going. So obviously this kind of changed the way our picture looks. We've got our grid on top of it now, but that's all right because this is really important to the whole design process. And you'll know that your grid is good enough if you can see in like a really detailed area. I like to look at the eye. Just looking at the eye itself, if there's like a really good amount of kind of squares within our grid in that area. If you were to say, you know, maybe you only had like 3 or 4 of these boxes in the eyeballs, then you would know that you either need to increase the amount of grids or the subdivisions within the grid itself. But this right here is like a good example. This one worked out pretty well for the numbers that I put in for my image. Okay, so to get started making this into the low poly, what we're going to want to do is get the polygonal lasso tool. So click and hold, make sure you have the polygonal lasso. And then an important thing to make sure we also have on, it should default to this, but it never hurts to check, is making sure we have snap turned on and we want it to snap to our grid. That's why we put the grid down, because our selections will now snap to the points in the grid. And what I mean by that is it's going to kind of snap to the intersections of these tiny little boxes within the grid itself. So you'll see I'll click right here and my mouse is in the middle of this square, but it's still snapping to one of the corners of it. And this is important. I'll explain later on once things start getting put together, but you'll see it's important when we kind of match up the edges of our selections. So to start, I'm just going to make a triangle selection. I like starting on the forehead just because it's a big open area, but you can start wherever you want. So I'm making this triangle. Doesn't really matter how, what shape or what kind of size your triangle is, but go with a triangle, something like that. And then what we need to do now is we need to make an action. Actions in Photoshop basically allow us to do a lot of things at once with just one button. So I'm going to go to Window, Actions. And you'll see that there's a bunch of extra stuff in here. Yours will probably look like this when it pops up. Just pull it down. This is all the default actions. We don't really care about these right now because we're going to make our own. So in order to do this, just like the New Layer button, we're going to click New Action. I'm going to name mine Low Poly. And then another important thing is we want to bind it to a key. So I'm going to choose F5 for mine. And this is not pressing F on your keyboard and the number 5 at the same time. This is the F5 key located at like the very top of your keyboard. So now we've got a key binding, and I'll press record. So I can see that recording is on, and everything I do after this point is going to be saved to this action. So step number 1, I'm going to copy my selection. So you can press Control-C or edit copy. I've got it copied now. Next, I'm going to make a new layer. So over here in the layers panel, create a new layer. And then I'm going to paste my selection. So edit, paste. And it looks like it went away, but it just pasted that selection right on top of the original image. So to get that selection back, we need to go over here to the layers panel, Make sure your mouse is over this kind of checkerboard area. Hold Control and click. You'll see when I hold Control, this little box pops up next to my cursor. So Control, click, and you'll see that I have my selection back again. It basically selected everything that was in that layer, which is what I pasted before. So now what we need to do is go to Filter, Blur, Average. And what this does is it takes the average color of everything that was in my selection and just fills the entire selection with that. So it's taking the average of all the colors that were in there and just putting it together as one. And now I can deselect this. So I'll go to Select, Deselect, and then very important, the last step is to click on background layer to take us back to where we started. And then I'm done with my action, so I can press this stop, and that stops the recording. So we can see everything that we did in here in the low poly action. We copied our selection, made a new layer, pasted it, selected it again, averaged it, deselected it, and then clicked back to the background layer. So that's everything that we need in our action. Make sure yours looks pretty much exactly like this. And what we can do now is we can make a new selection. And on my keyboard, instead of going through all those actions again, if I just press F5, it does all of that for me. And so I can just keep going around, and you'll see that this is all there is to it, really. Just clicking, making our selections in a triangle, pressing F5, and then it's doing the action for us. So what you notice that I'm doing is I'm lining up the edge of my next selection with the edge of my previous selection. This is important so we know that all of these triangles are kind of going to be touching, connecting together, and there's not going to be any gaps in our artwork. So to do that, I'm just seeing where the last one was, or just any other previous one, and then making a new triangle. It doesn't really matter the shape of like how long or wide you want it to be, but stick to triangles and make sure at least this one side matches up with another one that you've already got there. And you can obviously match up two sides if you want to fill in spaces like that. And then you can just go crazy and just start filling in all of these areas like this. So if you want to pause and kind of check your work and see how things are going, what you can do is hide the grid. And we know that the shortcut for that is Control''. So that's gone. And if we want to even get a better look at it, we can turn off the eyeball on this background layer. Now it doesn't look like much now, but this is the start of something that's going to look really cool when we get to the end of it. But to check, I can see that there's not really any gaps between here. They're all touching. It's looking good. And I can keep going, turn my grid back on, and just get right back to it. And so when you're making these triangles, the bigger selection that you make, the less detail that there's going to be. So what that means is in areas where there's not a lot of detail, for example, the forehead, you can really make these really big. Because look at this selection. There's not a whole lot going on here. It's starting to get to a shadow over here. But other than that, there's not a lot of detail. So I can really just do that in one big triangle. In areas where there's a lot of detail, like the eyes, eyebrows, nose, lips, things like that, you're going to want to make your triangles a lot smaller so you can capture those details more. So for example, if I go down in here, this is why you want to have a lot of boxes within the eyes, just so you can make more triangles out of it. So for this, I'm going to make close to as many triangles as I can within this space. But as you can see, in the area like this, like the eye, that's really detailed, I'm going to have a lot more triangles in here than like the whole forehead combined, all the triangles up in there, because there's just so much more details that are happening in here than there is in the entire kind of just plain open forehead area. And so other areas that you're going to want to keep that in mind for, probably the shadows around the nose, the lips, maybe the jawline itself, and just other detailed areas. Like if your person is wearing glasses, you're going to want to be able to capture that rim very specifically with your grids. So just some examples to look at here. This is an example that I made a long time ago. I don't expect yours to have this many triangles. I kind of kept it to a consistent size. So as you can see, I have around 1,400 layers. I don't expect that, but this is a good example of looking at how having smaller triangles can provide a lot more details, and you can really see the shapes and shadows that are forming across this face and we could still kind of tell who this person is, even though we put them into just a bunch of little triangles. This example right here is what happens when you make them a little too big. Simplifying the eye into like 4 or 5 triangles, you're going to lose a lot of the detail. The cheeks and the face, the lips itself. We're losing all of these details in this face just because that these triangles are so big, and it's just simplifying things just a little bit too much, and we're kind of losing all of that character. This is an example of what happens when you don't snap to grid and when you don't line up the edges of your triangles. You're going to have a bunch of these gaps in here, and then when you put in a background at the end of your project, you're just going to be able to see straight through your person, which isn't exactly what we're going for here. So again, important to remember that you match up all of these edges so there's no gaps. The gaps that are in there are just visual gaps within Photoshop itself. But yeah, making sure that all of these are lined up and look nice and neat and work well together so we don't see straight through the person itself.